Hey class, this is the Designing with TileMaps lab. This is the first lab in the designer tier. So I wanted you guys to get used to using tile maps before we go into the level design and some of the other labs, because it is going to take us a bit to get familiar with them, and they're kind of like the main building block for creating things in Godot. The first thing we're going to do in this lab is get a tile set. You can use the one that comes with the default project that you can download, or if you want to create your own, I recommend checking out another lab, the TileSets and Platforms lab in the artist tier. That's a good lab to kind of pair with this one if you want to make the art as well as doing the design in Godot. If you're just looking at doing the design, you can grab the art that's in the default download, or if you want to collaborate with another student, this is a good opportunity. You could find some tile sets on the open lab that somebody else created and just say, hey, I want to use these for my game, and you guys can get a couple collaboration points. This isn't about designing a full level. It's just getting used to using tile sets and tile maps so that you can create levels in the future. So when you post on the open lab, I'm not expecting to see like a full level. You can add as much stuff as you want. If you want to play around with it, add different art and try different things out, feel free to, go crazy and post whatever you want, but you don't need to create like a fully working level for this lab. There's a few links in the bottom in resources that will go into more depth about using tile sets as well as Autotiles. We're going to look at two pretty simple setups. One is just a basic tile setup using single tiles where you have to kind of draw everything. And then we're going to make a really, really simple Autotile setup where you can draw like a full tile just by drawing on the map. And using tile maps is really fun. It turns level design almost into like a drawing program where you can kind of draw your platforms or your scenery, whichever one you're using, around everywhere in Godot, and it makes it like super easy and intuitive once you get everything set up. If I have some time, I may make another video about tile sets to do like more of the auto tile stuff, which is super useful, but it does take a lot of setup. So I don't have time to go over all of that in this video. And keep in mind that I'm going to be showing a basic 2D platformer setup, but you can use tile sets for any style of game. It could be a top-down RPG game. It could be an isometric style game. You can use the same setup for any different style of game. It's just kind of changing the art to make it look like what you want to. So keep that in mind as you're designing. Even though in the video I'm going to be focusing on 2D platform style games, you might be working on something else, but the tile map setup is still basically the same. So I think that's enough of an intro. Let's get started. So to get started, you can download the designer default project. This has all the assets that you would need to do this lab. You can also use your own project. If you already have a game that you're working on, go ahead and open that one up. If not, just drag the designer default project into your folder and go ahead and open it up. There's a default scene we could use there, but let's go ahead and practice making our own scene. So we just click New Scene, give that a name, and then we have to create a root node for the scene. And we can call that Platforms. And then we'll add in our player scene. So now we can start designing our platforms. Let's add another node that will be the main node that we'll put our tile maps in. So we'll call this Platforms as well. And we can drag it above the player because we do want the player to appear on top of the platforms. Then we'll get started by adding a tile map. And a tile map is basically a thing in Godot that's going to keep track of where we want to put our tiles. So we can use the same tiles over and over again and draw a big map. And it will also be used to interact with the player. So the player can stand on platforms or run into walls. Once we have a tile map, we have to create a tile set. So just click on the empty and click New Tile Set. And then when you open that, it's going to open up the tile set editor in the window. So it's a little confusing. The tile map is basically the location of everything on the map. And the tile set is just all of the tiles that we want to place in the tile map. So once we have our tile set open, we are going to drag in the platforms image, and we're going to start with our basic tiles. The art may be pretty small, so let's just increase the zoom to make it easier to edit. So for this basic tile set, we're going to be making tiles out of each frame of our sprite sheet, and then we'll draw on the tile map to put them together. So to start, we just click the new single tile button. This is the most basic type of tile. And we also want to turn on the snap parameters. And this will show a little grid, and you can see that our art is sized as the same size as the tiles expect. Now, this is set up in the snap options. You can see if we change the size, then the art doesn't really fit anymore. So that's one reason that it's good to look at the size in Pascal before we export it and use it in Godot. So I designed my art in 32 by 32, and so it fits perfectly. You can change the snap very easily, but it's important to know exactly what the width and height of each one of your frames in the sprite sheet is. So once I add a new single tile, I just have to click on that tile and it'll make a little yellow box. And then there's some parameters there. I can give the tile a name. I'm going to call this tile middle because I use it to kind of fill in everything. The player doesn't actually stand on this tile. It's just kind of like a filler. Let's make another single tile and choose the next frame. This one is also kind of a middle tile, like the player is never going to stand on there, but it fills in where two different tiles meet. So we'll call that middle left. And then this is middle right. Those just have a little bit of grass on the edges to fill in these corners that we'll see later. So those are just some regions. We'll be able to add those tiles to the tile map, but the player won't be stepping on those, at least not the way that I'm going to design it. So we don't need collision for that. When we go to our next tile, this is going to be kind of the main default tile the player will be standing on. And so I'm going to go to the collision section, choose box, and then click on that tile. And you'll see it's going to make a box that's the exact same size as the tile. If I turn off the snap parameters, I can change the size of the box to make something more complex. But for what we're doing, a box is fine. So I'm going to leave that. And I'll give that tile a name. Again, I just want to give it a name so it's easier to find it when I'm editing later. So I'll just call this default because that's what I'll be using a lot. So next, I'm going to make a single tile for my right edge. And this one, the player will be able to stand on. So I'm going to add a collision there and call that right edge. And then I'll move on to the right wall. So I'll just call that right. And this one also needs a collision. And then we'll just keep going with these last two, same thing. Each one of these needs a collision. So this is the left edge. And the last one is the left wall. So I'll just call that left. So those last five all have collisions, and we're going to make walls and platforms for the player to stand on and run into. So we've got all our tiles set up, and now we're going to see how we're actually going to start drawing in our tile map. So when we go back to our scene editor and choose the tile map, now we can see all our tiles and they have nice little labels, but it doesn't actually match the setup that we have in our scene. You can see the tile is only a quarter of the size of what it expects. To fix that, we're going to have to change the cell size that the tile map is expecting. And you can see it's expecting 64 by 64, but we have 32 by 32. So you don't have to use 32 by 32, but they do have to match. So that's what we need to adjust. So let's change that to 32 by 32. And now we can see our tiles are sitting right next to each other, which is what we want. We can draw these nice big blocks of tile. And if we want to make the grid a little bit simpler, we can go up to the toolbar and go to the snap options, configure snap. And then you can see where the grid steps fall. So if we do 16 by 16, that's a little bit closer, but we are working with 32 by 32. So we can change this. And this doesn't actually really matter as far as how the game works. This just makes it easy for us to see where the tiles can go. So once I have that set up, that looks pretty good. Let's play our scene. And what we're going to see is our player falls through the platform. And that's because we did not add a collision to those middle tiles. One thing I just noticed is the player doesn't have a camera. And rather than setting up that whole camera thing again, what I can do is just use this nice function called merge from scene. So I'll right click on my platforms node, go to merge from scene and find my default scene, and then just find my player that already has the camera attached. And now we can see it's in there and the camera's already working. We don't have to go through and set that whole thing up again. So that's a good way to get things from one scene into another. Okay, so let's add our default tiles that do have colliders. And now our player will actually land on the tile. Okay, so that's pretty cool. He can walk back and forth, and that looks pretty good. You can see his feet are kind of sitting above the tile. And so here we can actually adjust the collider for our player. And this is kind of what I was talking about when we were designing the art, leaving a little bit of transparency at the top of the tile so we can overlap with the art. So if we want our players' feet to overlap with our platforms, we also need to adjust the collider. So the bottom of that collision shape is always going to be resting on the top of the platforms. And so if we let the feet go just a little bit below the collision shape, and let's check to make sure that the collision matches the body even when we turn around. So let's actually center that a little bit. And so when we flip, that matches pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's good enough for what we're doing. And so now we can see it's a subtle difference, but now you can see his feet are actually kind of in the grass, which is the effect that I was going for. This isn't what you have to do. This is just one effect that I happen to like. And so you might have other designs or other effects that you're going for, but I just wanted to show how that would work by adjusting the collider as well as the platform. So now we added some edges and the player can fall off the edge. And right now I'm just adding everything in just by kind of drawing. And if you use the left mouse button, you can just draw and add tiles to any area in the grid. And if you go over the same area twice, it will delete the previous tile. So you don't really have to worry about that, but it can be a little bit tricky to stay in the lines. As you can see, I was having a hard time doing that. You can also use the right button on the mouse to remove tiles. So if I screw up, I'll go back and just mouse over everything with the right mouse and remove the tiles that I don't want. And so I can kind of fill in this block like this with all these middle tiles. And those don't have collisions on them, so that's kind of good. It's not checking all the collisions on these extra tiles that our player can't reach. And so now we have a little platform. Our player can kind of fall infinitely, or at least for a while. And so we don't want our camera to follow our player for as long as they fall. So let's adjust the top and bottom limits of the camera. So this way, when the player falls, it'll track her a little bit, but then it'll stop. And so that way we don't have to make our tiles go on infinitely. We can just draw our platforms so that as the player falls down, we don't run out of tile space. And now when our player jumps off, eventually the camera will stop and the player will keep going. So that's a good use for the camera limits if you're designing a platformer like this with gravity and platforms like this that go to the bottom of the screen. So now I'm going to bring up my little modifier key visualizer to show a more efficient way of drawing tiles. Before I was just filling in each tile individually, but you can see that if I hold Shift and then draw across, I can actually draw like a line of tiles. And that's more efficient because it's a little less mistake prone. I can fill in those edges. Let's fill in the left wall. And so I'm using Shift just so I don't have to draw each tile individually. I can draw a line. And then I can fill in my whole middle area by holding Command and Shift together, and then I can fill up a whole space very quickly. So that's a little more efficient than waving my mouse around and trying to get all of those tiles exactly right. So the next thing I'm going to try is making like a little wall for my player to run into. And so I'm just going to draw using the left wall. I'm just going to kind of draw up from the tile. You can see that it's kind of overlapping in a weird way. So that's what I made those little edges for. So we can have a middle tile that connects the top or default tile and the left wall tile. And so now I can fill in the middle. And so now I have a little wall. And this wall is part of the rest of the platform. So that's what I use that kind of like edge tile for, and the left wall. So I can create these large kind of continuous tiles. But that's not the only way that you can design a tile. You'll see lots of games that just kind of use like one long platform, something like that in the middle of a scene. You don't have to have the edges. It can be flat on the sides. A lot of games use stuff like that as well. So just want to try to show a variety of different styles that you might use. The next thing we'll look at is pass-through tiles. So you can see if I draw like a tile right here above the player's head, that one of the issues that we might run into is that when the player jumps, their head just runs into that tile. They don't pass through, so they can't jump onto the tile or the space above it. And you might want to keep that functionality, or you might not want to. there are different games where we can see different versions of that being used. For example, in Mario, if you jump up and your head hits a block, then you just fall back down. But there are other games where you would pass through those tiles and be able to jump up onto that platform. So to do that, I'm actually going to create a new tile set. And first I'm going to save this tile set so I can use it in other scenes and other projects. So I'm just going to click save on the tile set. And you don't have to do this if your tile set is only existing in that one scene. But if you want to actually be able to use this tile set, and what I really want to do is duplicate it, we need to save it as a file. So I'm going to call this platform's default, and I'm going to save that. So I'm going to add a new tile map in here. The nice thing about saving my previous tile set as a file is I can duplicate that file. And so I don't have to spend all of my time recreating all those tiles. I can just duplicate that file and then make the changes that I want to make in the copy. So I'm going to duplicate this, call this platform's Passthrough. And so for these tiles, I won't have colliders on the walls. I'll make it so you can pass through the bottom of the main platform. So let's grab our second tile map. Let's change the tile set. I'm going to grab that. You can see everything is still there. I'm just going to make a couple changes. So by clicking selected collision, that means that the player will not hit the tile if he's below it. And then I'm actually just going to delete the colliders on the left and right walls completely. And then I'll also make sure to change the colliders for the edges to also pass through. We can see that my tiles don't match. So I have to change the cell size again. So let's change that to 32 by 32. And now I'm going to draw a new version of the platform that I have here, and the player should be able to pass through it. So I'm going to bring back my modifier keys just so you can see when I'm using Shift and Command. I'm still kind of playing with the best version of these visualizations to use as I'm recording these videos. So there you can see I can draw this nice big long platform. It's overlapping with our previous tile map, so let's just go and drag that tile map up in the hierarchy and it will appear behind the other tile. So now we've got this new platform that's kind of in the background. And so I can actually have as many tile maps as I want, and they'll all work basically the same way. I don't just need to have like a new tile set to add a tile map. I can copy and paste or duplicate tile maps and use as many as I want to. It may be easier to organize your scene that way. Now I have this pass-through tile, and so my player can jump up. He can't quite make it up to that platform, so maybe we can edit that a little bit for him so he can make it up there. I can also just take the move tool and move the entire tile map down one segment. That's another way that I can edit tile maps. I don't have to redraw everything. I can also just move the tile map node around in space. So I'm going to draw the edges on here because I like the way that looks, but you don't have to do that. You can leave it just flat if you want, or you can do other design choices as well. But that looks pretty good. I kind of have this little platform in the background that I can walk through and jump on, whereas the wall on the other side I'm going to run into. So I can create a little depth that way in my scene. So that's pretty good for our basic tile setup. I want to quickly cover making an auto tile. The basic tile setup is perfectly fine. You can use this and create anything you want to in your game. I'm going to cover how to set up a quick auto tile just because it does make things a little bit faster. So I'm going to create a new tile map, and I'm going to create a new tile set as well. And I'll save that. I'm going to go ahead and save that right away since I know I'm going to want to save it later. And I'll just call this platform auto. And the basic idea behind an auto tile set is that it fills in the areas that you're drawing according to how you say that you want to fill it in. So instead of having to place the middle tiles and the top tiles and the edge tiles in different places, it'll actually figure out for you, if I just draw a platform in an area, which type of tile to put where. So the left edge will go on the left and the right edge will go on the left and the middle will go in the middle. So this takes a little bit more setup, but it may save us some time when we're drawing the tiles themselves. I don't want to take the time to explain the whole thing in this video. So what I'm going to do is just a very simple version of it that hopefully will be a good introduction. And again, I'll link to some tutorials to do more complex auto tile setups. So I'm going to drag my auto platforms, and you can see there's 3 tiles here, but 2 of them are just kind of on the edges. So I'm going to create a new auto tile and just drag across those 3 tiles. And again, it works because it's 32 by 32, and that's the default, so I don't have to change that. I do have to go into the Autotile bit mask and choose 3 by 3 minimal. That's the setup that I want to use. You'll see what that looks like in a moment. Next, I'm going to add a collision. I'm just going to add it to the middle tile. The player will be able to jump through the edges of these platforms, so I just need that middle tile to work. Let's go over to bit mask. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but basically with the bit mask, the red dots represent the tile layout, and the middle red dot represents each tile's self. And so we can connect the tiles by just drawing in the red dots that the tiles are connected by. For the center tile, we can connect to the right and left. For the left, we only connect to the middle. And for the right, we only connect back to the middle. So it's pretty simple. There's a lot more complicated things we can do to set this up. Let's just name our tile real quick. And we can also choose an icon since there's multiple tiles. We might want to choose a specific icon so we know what we're looking at. Let's go ahead and change the cell size of our tile map to 32. And now you can see I can just draw platforms and it just knows where to put the edges. So I don't have to spend the extra step choosing all the different platforms. I just have one tile that I use over and over again. So these aren't pass-through tiles. You can make auto tiles pass through just like you can make other tiles pass through. And so now we have a bunch more platforms that we can just add very easily using auto tiles. So both of these approaches are totally legitimate. You can make essentially the same things with either approach. You may just save yourself a little bit of time using the auto tile. We can also duplicate this map. So I'm just going to create another tile map by duplicating it and then use the move tool. And you can see I can just move them and they work exactly the same. That's an easy way to add new tiles to the design. If you have like a pattern that you like, or you need to repeat a lot of stuff, instead of just drawing over and over again, I recommend using little shortcuts like that. Just duplicate a tile map and place it wherever you want to. So that's everything I wanted to cover for tile maps and tile sets for this video. It's probably a lot to learn in one video, but hopefully it made sense and hopefully it'll make it easier for you to design your levels in the future. So let's add some documentation. Let's just take a couple of screenshots of our tiles in Godot. Now that we've got our screenshots, let's go over to the Open Lab and create a new post. And we want to find the category. So this is under Designer, Designing with Tile Maps. And just add a little title. I can say my tile maps or tile sets or whatever you want to put there. And you can just put a quick description. If you used another person's art, you might want to mention that. And if you were going for a specific style, or you used, the single tile style or the auto tile, whichever one you felt was most useful, you could say something about that. I also said that I'm designing a 2D platformer game, so that might be relevant based on what we're looking at. And then just drag in your screenshots. I put mine kind of in order of this little level, but keep in mind, we're not at the level design process quite yet. We're just learning the basics. So it's okay if you don't have a full level to show here. Let's preview that post real quick. And that looks pretty good. So we should be happy with that. And go ahead and publish, and you should be done with this lab.